Chapter 7. Conquering Hero. They came down from Harlem by the thousands on the West Side BMT and East Side IRT lines, by bus and on foot, dressed in their Sunday finest. Once inside Madison Square Garden, then an immense Moorish pile on the corner of 26th Street and 5th Avenue, they waved banners of black, green, and crimson and sang along as three brass bands trumpeted Ethiopia, thou land of our fathers. Some of the attendees had roots in New York, but most were just a few years removed from a sharecropper's shotgun shack in Georgia or the Carolinas, having fled the poverty and violence of the Jim Crow South for the promise of jobs and freedom in the urban North. On the evening of August 2, 1920, they had come to hear about a new journey to freedom, from a new kind of messenger. Theirs was an unlikely Moses. A squat, pudgy-cheeked former printer and labor organizer from Jamaica, 33-year-old Marcus Garvey was not much to look at, even dressed as he was in academic cap and gown of purple and gold. But, like most of his audience, he was a dark-skinned man, one who spoke with the pugnacious eloquence of the Harlem streets about long-suffered indignities and new ambitions. We do not desire what has belonged to others, though others have always sought to deprive us of that which belonged to us, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, proclaimed through the saucer-sized microphone. If Europe is for the Europeans, then Africa shall be for the black peoples of the world. Garvey had launched the organization 6 years earlier in the Caribbean, to challenge British rule and raise consciousness among the black working classes of the islands. But he made little headway, and moved on to New York, where he quickly adopted a message, of black capitalism and racial solidarity, more suited to his new home. The message caught fire. To electrified audiences in New York and across America, Garvey sold shares in the UNIA and with the proceeds purchased an imposing headquarters on 138th Street, which he dubbed Liberty Hall, and founded a steamship company, the Black Star Line, to realize the most ambitious enterprise of all, the mass emigration of black people to Africa and the continent's liberation from European colonialists. We shall now organize the 400 million Negroes of the world into a vast organization to plant the banner of freedom, he announced that August evening to the cheering working-class throng, few of whom knew much about Africa beyond the fact that it was, like America, a place where the white man ruled and the black man suffered. But at least one of the 25,000 people in attendance had a more nuanced understanding of Africa. Few Liberians could boast a more illustrious pedigree than Gabriel Moore Johnson, mayor of Monrovia. His grandfather, Elijah, a patriot hero, had rallied the first settlers against the ACS and native armies. His father, Hillary, a Fordham president, forged the political alliance that ended a half-century of black-mulatto feuding, and his brother-in-law, Charles Dunbar Burgess King, was the sitting president of the republic. Johnson intended to make a little history of his own by wooing the largest back-to-Africa movement America had ever known. "I bring you greetings from Liberia," Johnson addressed a delegates-only meeting at Liberty Hall the night after Garvey's Madison Square Garden rally, "and we hope that this organization will take on the right spirit and with concerted action on your part, and, with our assistance Liberia someday may grow and prosper and be what we all desire it to be, a great republic." Garvey wholeheartedly concurred. He announced plans to move the UNIA's headquarters to Monrovia and crown Johnson Potentate, the titular head of the organization. 2 months later, Garvey launched a campaign to raise millions of dollars to build a city on a hill in the African jungle, where tens of thousands of Garveyites could prosper and breathe free. Johnson and other Liberian leaders understood that this utopian vision would never be realized. Still, they hoped that Garvey's plans might lead to a modest infusion of civilized immigrants and, more important, their money. The Liberians also hedged their bets. Skeptical of Garvey's grandiose promises and wary of his talk of Pan-African liberation, which might also involve the liberation of Liberia's own native masses, they courted successive administrations in Washington, seeking loans on favorable terms, even if this meant allowing another foreign government control of its finances. They reasoned that, at the very least, America had no territorial ambitions on Africa. They also made sure to tell all parties what they wanted to hear. When Garvey spoke of international black solidarity, they nodded sympathetically, especially in the first years when it seemed like anything was possible for the UNIA and its growing legions of enthusiastic followers. At the same time, they winked knowingly to US and European governments, assuring them they had no intention of letting Liberia be the staging ground for Garvey's Pan-African Revolution. Long gone was talk of Liberia as the last great hope and refuge of the black diaspora. In its place was a pragmatic nationalism, a desire to protect the nation's sovereignty above all other considerations and to ward off the potential challenges to elite rule. As Lord Carey had discovered many years before, idealism must be sloughed off when survival is at stake. Not that Liberians were unified in their response to Garvey. Followers of the late Edward Blyden, who had died less than a decade before the UNIA announced its Liberia plans, could not have helped but be encouraged by this powerful figure from America who talked a lot like their intellectual mentor. Meanwhile, less well-off Americos, especially in the upriver settlements where, presumably, the Garveyites would settle, became as enamored with Garvey's talk of black self-help and economic liberation as the thousands of American blacks who filled Madison Square Garden on that August evening in 1920. But their hopes would soon be dashed. Over the next 4 years, Johnson, the settler elite, and the UNIA would engage in a dance of deception that, in the end, would see Johnson exiled, the UNIA banned from Liberia, and the government in Monrovia throw itself into the arms of another, very different American savior with a double-edged promise. Eli Garcia did not ignore the warning signs in Monrovia. The Haitian immigrant, who had risen to the top ranks of the UNIA leadership through his efforts as a salesman of Black Star shares, had been dispatched to Liberia by Garvey several months before the Garden event, to meet with officials, explain his organization's plans, and, most important, determine whether these descendants of slavery would welcome their modern African American brethren home. The initial reception was mixed. Though he was the first Garvey official to visit the country, he was met by 2 official delegations when he reached Liberia. A day after his arrival, however, the xenophobic Liberian commercial whose masthead read "Liberia is ours to maintain, ours to defend, and ours to enjoy" ran an anti-UNIA article claiming that the organization was a scam and urged Liberians to keep their distance from it. When Garcia met with the paper's influential publisher, Abraham Butler, he was grilled in a very uncivil manner, not unexpectedly, perhaps, given that the man was also Monrovia's chief of police. From then on, however, he met almost universal acclaim. A meeting of local UNIA chapters, held in the congressional chambers, was packed, he reported, with the local elite, including the former President Arthur Barkley and Chief Justice F.E.R. Johnson, Gabriel's brother. Over the next month, Garcia took Garvey's message across the country, to similar response. After a visit to the upriver community of Brewerville, he wrote, "I have been traveling in the interest of the UNIA for a while, and it seems to me that nowhere the UNIA has ever met with more emotional feelings." Oni could see on every face the clear indication that those poor souls who had long suffered were sincere in their welcome. In Monrovia, Garcia visited the presidential mansion and was introduced to the newly inaugurated President King, who formally declared that the government welcomed the UNIA to Liberia and that it will be soon when the headquarters shall be established in Liberia, for which purpose land and other facilities will be granted. But for all the excitement, Garcia had doubts about Liberia's true feelings concerning the prospective emigration of well-funded, idealistic, and ambitious black nationalists from America. He learned that Liberian society, particularly its upper reaches, was deeply divided over how to respond to the UNIA's plans for their country. Local supporters hinted of commercial conspiracies, about businessmen not keen on new competition, which may have explained the broadside in the Liberian commercial. It is said that Mr. Butler's paper is subsidized by firms and that soon after they had learned of my coming, they started the propaganda against us, which was for a while disastrous for the selling of shares of the Black Star Line. The UNIA envoy soon uncovered something even more insidious at work. While in Monrovia, I went to a dry goods and bought several yards of khaki to have 2 pairs of trousers made, Garcia reported to Garvey. As I was stepping out of the store, my companion, an Liberian, told me, "Why, I don't suppose you are going to carry this bundle yourself?" "Why not?" said I, "it is a very small parcel." He answered that it was not the custom in Liberia for any gentleman to carry parcels, therefore the usefulness of having slaves. Visitors to Liberia, particularly white ones, had long accused the Americos of mistreating the natives, but a similar assessment from Garcia would likely spark a controversy. Garcia's bold recommendations as to how the organization should proceed, particularly in regards to settler-native relations, reflected the sensitive nature of his findings. In an addendum to his official report that he carefully labeled for the personal information of the President General, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, Garcia suggested the UNIA simply bypass the Americos. The Liberian politicians understand that they are degenerated and weak morally, and they know that if any number of honest Negroes with brains, energy and experience come to Liberia and are prompted to take part in the ruling of the natives, they, the Liberians, will be absorbed and ousted in a very short time. This intention of the UNIA must be kept quiet for a while. Emphases in original. Whether or not Garvey took Garcia's message into account, several months after the latter's return to New York in August 1920, He dispatched a three-man vanguard to begin acquiring land and establishing businesses in preparation for the emigration of the masses. The trio was led by Cyril Critchlow, a director of the Black Star Line. Tall and heavy-set, the University of Nebraska alum and owner of a New York secretarial school was typical of the educated, middle-class Caribbean and North American blacks drawn to the UNIA and its promise of both racial uplift and entrepreneurial opportunity. Joseph Johnson, no relation to the Liberian Johnsons, the black U.S. minister in Monrovia, described the Trinidadian-born Critchlow as a man thoroughly imbued with the go-ahead American spirit. Despite a warm reception from ordinary Liberians and government offers of land leases, Critchlow was wary. He had no doubt been briefed by his good friend Garcia. From our arrival in Monrovia, Critchlow reported to Garvey, I gradually sensed that the potentate, Gabriel Johnson, and the Supreme Deputy, George Osborne Mark, a schoolboy chum of Johnson's, were putting their heads together and would do all in their power to embarrass me so that in the end I would be forced out or my wings clipped so the two of them could control the expenditures. When Johnson's son Hillary was hired to run the UNIA office in Monrovia, the situation deteriorated further. The son, Critchlow noted, started at once by coming to work late, and sometimes never showing up until late in the afternoon, and sometimes not showing up at all. Critchlow then instituted a thoroughly American solution, a sign and timesheet. This, Hillary, treated with contempt, he noted, signing it when he pleased and sometimes not signing it at all. Then, at the end of April when I looked for the timesheet for that month, it had disappeared. The source of the problem, as Critchlow saw it, was not just that the son felt himself above the job of a mere clerk. His constant grumble was that he was educated in the United States, graduated from some college or other, and had more ability than any of the other men, but that his loyalties and interests lay elsewhere. As it turned out, Hillary was spending most of his time seeing to his family's transport business. His father, Critchlow reported, was primarily concerned with the same matter. He has a number of little pet schemes that he intends to combine with the UNIA's program in order to make some money for himself. Among these was an old, leaky building on Broad Street, downtown Monrovia, that he planned to sell or lease to the Garveyites, as well as arrangements whereby settlers would be turned over to certain persons who would board and lodge them, paying His Highness, i.e., Johnson, a consideration. Critchlow declined both deals. He and Johnson continued to bicker over who was in charge of the mission, with Critchlow sending letter upon letter to Garvey, asking him to settle the matter once and for all, but to little effect. 3 months into his stay, an exhausted Critchlow wired his resignation to New York, on account of serious personal difficulties with potentate and supreme deputy, position untenable. The UNIA Executive Board refused to accept it. Critchlow fell ill with chronic enteritis, a painful inflammation of the intestines. Liberia's sanitary and health officer urged him to leave the tropics immediately. But with Johnson in control of UNIA funds, Critchlow was stuck, pleading in vain for his organization to send him money. Eventually, the intercession of the American minister in Monrovia secured his passage on a British steamer. Furious, he dashed off a last letter to Garvey before leaving Monrovia. An organization that would send a man to his death without compunction would be a very dangerous organization to be in the service of. While understandably upset at his treatment by UNIA officials, Critchlow still believed in the organization's mission. Like Garcia, he warned Garvey of the pitfalls of working with the Americo-Liberians. He was emphatic, do not put them in charge of UNIA affairs, as their clannishness and sensitiveness will but lead to irrecoverable disaster, and is certain to have things accomplished in the good old-fashioned Liberian way, which is beautifully less than nothing. Reflecting on his own experiences, he concluded, no self-respecting American or West Indian would tolerate being placed under any Liberian for the execution of business. The criticism was reciprocated. African Americans believe they knew too much, is how Critchlow characterized Liberian opinion, and are more aggressive in their methods. Or as young Hillary Johnson put it during the timesheet affair, he, Critchlow, was like the rest of them, African Americans, trying to be too strict. It was a true clash of cultures. For all their misgivings about their homeland, the Garveyites were Americans, energetic, proud, and naive in their idealism. When they spoke enthusiastically of great waves of immigrants landing on Liberian shores, new enterprises, and a new day in the country's history, the Americo elite, the survivors of imperialist aggression and financial indenture, heard only invasion, interference, and more threats to their prized sovereignty. Cyril Henry, an African-American missionary and longtime resident of Liberia, adopted the voice of a Liberian official to capture local attitudes toward Garveyite plans. You are welcome, they say, but your numbers, your influence and combined power should not be sufficient to supplant our political preferments, i.e., the presidency, the secretaryship, consulships abroad, customs service, etc., he wrote to a UNIA official. You must adopt our ways, be scattered amongst us, be not overzealous about the affairs of the aborigines, us first. For much of its 100-year history, except when food and housing was scarce, or when, in the 1860s, J. Roberts's ruling party feared an influx of darker-skinned people from the West Indies who might join a blind and led opposition, Liberia had done everything it could to lure new settlers from across the Atlantic. A few citizens traveled back to the United States to spread the good word, others wrote letters, articles, and books to persuade African Americans to emigrate. We are proprietors of the soil we live on, and possess the rights of freeholders. Read the address of the colonists to the free people of color in the U.S., reprinted in an 1827 edition of the ACS organ, the African Repository. Our suffrages, and, what is of more importance, our sentiments and our opinions have their due weight in the government we live under. These were not empty claims. New settlers were given land, offered aid, and, after independence, were awarded citizenship on arrival. Yet few blacks in America or the West Indies had the means or the inclination to emigrate to a nation still notorious for disease and economic troubles. Isolated and surrounded by hostile powers for 2 generations, Liberians grew suspicious of foreigners and paranoid of outside interference. Their impulse to help their oppressed brothers and sisters diminished as their nation sunk into debilitating poverty. The founding generations, renewed by a steady stream of immigrants and by the idea of Liberia as the last best hope for the African diaspora, had given way to a shrewd, hard-nosed, or, in Critchlow's estimation, a more self-serving, ethos. By the 1920s, the Americo elite, like the nation from which their forefathers had emigrated, had become far more selective about whom they let in. The arrival of settlers is not greatly desired by Liberians. Americans especially are not particularly wanted, Critchlow noted to Garvey, unless they have money. President King embodied this ambivalence. He first encountered the UNIA in the winter and spring of 1919, when, as foreign minister, he led the Liberian delegation to the post-World War I Paris Peace Conference. Eliezer Cadet, a 22-year-old Haitian national representing the UNIA, met with the Liberians in King's Hotel suite and immediately tried to push organization pamphlets and newspapers on them, each containing large headlines and inflammatory wording, emphasizing a day of judgment and retribution for the American people. Brs. Henry Worley, American financial advisor to Liberia, described the scene. Cadet called on Secretary King and endeavored to arouse in him some sort of movement but I think did not receive much encouragement. King asked him, if the American Negroes were so thoroughly dissatisfied with the social and political conditions in America, why they did not go to Liberia, which is a Negro republic founded by the United States, and become citizens there where they would have social and political equality. When he met with Garcia a year and a half later as president and in the executive mansion, King was more encouraging, promising land and facilities to the UNIA should it relocate its headquarters to the Liberian capital. But King's public stance was more reserved. He had good reason to hold back. Too close an association with Garvey would jeopardize a much bigger prize, a $5 million U.S. government-backed loan, which King and many other Liberians felt was their due. In the early years of World War I, Liberia had experienced a brief period of prosperity selling much-needed tropical products, most notably, the palm oil that lubricated the war's big guns, to the belligerents. But when the United States entered the war in April 1917, it pressured Monrovia to sever ties with Berlin, which, by the early 20th century, had become the country's leading trade partner. King felt that his nation was owed something for this act of loyalty. In the spring of 1921, King and several of his advisors traveled to the United States to lobby Washington for the loan but also to take the measure of the UNIA up close. Upon his arrival in New York, he hosted a 5-man Garveyite delegation at his suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where they discussed UNIA plans for the Black Republic. Oddly, Garvey was not in attendance. He did, however, write a personal letter to King, attempting to alleviate the latter's concerns about a UNIA takeover of his country. The purpose of the Universal Negro Improvement Association with respect to the Republic of Liberia, he wrote, is solely and purely industrial and commercial, with a view of assisting the peoples of Liberia in strengthening and improving their country, generally. But as Garvey and the UNIA offered promises and assurances, King and his delegation were hearing from African Americans who were disdainful of Garvey's populist theatrics, opposed to his separatist politics, and suspicious of his economic schemes. Just days after the Liberians' arrival in New York, A Bureau of Investigation operative reported to J. Edgar Hoover that there is a strong feeling among a number of the leading businessmen, Negro, to find out from President King whether he approves of the Garvey Liberian loan or whether it is an independent scheme of Garvey's to fleece the public. They seem to feel that Garvey should be openly denounced by King. In early April, King met with Richard Robert Wright, who had been one of the highest-ranking black officers in the U.S. military and was then the head of a Negro college in Georgia, who urged him against the UNIA. King later told a State Department official that Wright impressed the most of any Negro he had met in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois had weighed in even before King's arrival. Had Garvey asked permission of the Liberian government before making plans to relocate his headquarters there? He asked in an editorial in The Crisis, the NAACP paper he edited. Does he presume to usurp authority in a land which has successfully withstood England, France, and the United States, but is expected tamely to submit to Marcus Garvey? America's leading black intellectual had taken exception to Garvey's Back to Africa program from the start. While he admired and even envied the Jamaican leader's ability to connect with the masses, he felt the black nationalist message was a dangerous distraction. Give up. Surrender. The struggle, for equal rights in America, is useless. Back to Africa and fight the white world, was his mocking assessment of the UNIA's plans. Moreover, Du Bois had come to believe, like the African-American businessman the Bureau's agent had reported on, that Garvey's campaign to raise money for his Black Star Line and the Liberian construction loan bonds were, at best, ill-conceived ideas that would only serve to part thousands of working-class blacks from their hard-earned wages. But as he made his way from New York to Washington, King's focus was on the loan. Like most educated Liberians, he was an astute observer of American politics and was no doubt aware of the isolationist sentiment and fiscal probity that had overtaken the country in the wake of President Warren Normalcy Harding's landslide Republican election victory in 1920. Getting $5 million for Liberia from the U.S. Treasury would not be easy. Was Garvey's talk of a $2 million construction loan for Liberia legitimate? King was not sure and so did not want to alienate the UNIA. In a letter to The Crisis, solicited by Du Bois, King hedged, Liberia has been an independent country since 1847 and naturally it has never considered the surrender of its sovereignty to any nation or organization. On the other hand, Liberia has always regarded itself as the natural refuge and center for persons of Negro descent the world over. But the Liberian president's delicate balancing act was threatened by Garvey's incendiary oratory. In late April, King told F. W. Elliger, a top UNIA officer, that he objected to Garvey's method of telling the white people just what he is going to do, and that while he, as a Liberian would like to see the Negroes own Africa, he would be a fool to tell them so openly. While Garvey's confidence in his Liberia project knew no bounds, some in the UNIA began to express doubt. Elliger, for instance, had traveled to Washington in April specifically to tell the Liberian president not to say anything for or against Garvey's Liberian loan, as it would cause a panic and a run on Garvey's office, and probably his life, if the poor people who subscribed to the loan found out that the Liberian government was not behind it, as was the general impression among all of Garvey's followers. King, still unsure about the fate of the U.S. government loan, agreed, though he noted that since his arrival in Washington the representatives of British, French and American governments persistently asked him whether he endorsed the UNIA's Liberian plans, or not. On August 3, Harding set aside his isolationism and revived the party of Lincoln's paternalist sympathies for downtrodden blacks. He urged Congress to approve the Liberian loan. Garvey understood the import of the president's message. The very next day he dispatched a letter congratulating King on the news but also pleading with him to ignore certain misrepresentations as to the political aims of this association, i.e., the UNIA, toward Liberia. Garvey's case began to suffer additional setbacks. In October, the radical Harlem paper The Crusader, a UNIA foe, ran an editorial headline "Figures Never Lie, but Liars Do" figure by W. A. Domingo, a Jamaican immigrant and longtime acquaintance of Garvey. Domingo alleged that little of the $144,000 raised for the construction loan had gone to Liberia, rather, it had been wasted or diverted to the Black Star Line and Negro World, the UNIA newspaper. Both duplicity and incompetence were at work, Domingo asserted, adding that a $4,400 sawmill destined for Africa still sat in a Hoboken warehouse. Several months later the Crusader printed a series of scathing articles accompanied by incriminating UNIA documents. The author was Critchlow, who alleged that everyone involved in Garvey's scheme, American and Liberian, was corrupt and incompetent. Tee vaporings of the Negro world notwithstanding, he wrote, the UNIA is doing next to nothing in the furtherance of its Liberian construction and African redemption program. For all his inflammatory rhetoric about liberating the world's 400 million Negroes, Garvey's plans were for the most part not radical ones. Indeed, he had first come to the United States to study with Booker T. Washington. He preached the gospel of success, both individual and racial. Garvey urged his followers to invest, for the race, of course, but also for their own personal financial futures, in steamship lines, construction bonds, and real estate. His speeches frequently followed the rhythms of a salesman's patter. But Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover, his ambitious young protege at the Bureau of Investigation, heard something different. They heard a black man spewing a radical, anti-American ideology and worried as millions of Negroes listened and applauded. Hoover, as one historian of early 20th century black America noted, was hooked on a fixation about Garvey and the UNIA, which would before long become a vendetta. Agents were assigned to the case, white ones at first, but that proved counterproductive in dealing with an organization that thrived on conspiracy theories. So Hoover reluctantly hired the Bureau's first black agents to infiltrate Garvey's inner circle, seeking evidence that would allow him to prosecute Garvey or, at the very least, deport him back to Jamaica. He would find the evidence he needed. Bookkeeping at the UNIA was notoriously sloppy and there were many angry former employees still waiting to be paid and ready to talk to what they thought was another disgruntled Garveyite. The Black Star Line captain J. W. Jones, for one, spoke to an agent about tens of thousands of dollars, raised from investors for Liberian construction, diverted to pay the salaries of UNIA officials and fund their lavish travel junkets. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was the secret report Eli Garcia had sent to Garvey in the summer of 1920. Liberians are absolutely hostile to immigration of American or West Indian Negroes, that is, if said Negroes show any tendency to take part in the political life of the Republic, he wrote, adding, "Starving Liberia has no conditions at the present for any large number of persons." As Hubert Harrison, a former Negro World editor, later told government investigators, the Garcia memo clearly showed that Garvey knew he had no base, in Liberia, to work from or on, even as he was telling investors, in speeches and prospectuses sent by U.S. mail, a key component in a federal indictment, just the opposite. All those who have not bought shares, in the Black Star Line are urged, to do so immediately, Garvey announced in a year's end sales pitch, because between January 1 and December 31, 1921, it is expected that, the UNIA, will have transported between 500,000 and 1 million civilized, industrious Negroes from this Western Hemisphere into the Great Republic of Liberia. On January 12, 1922, Garvey was arrested by Hoover's agents in New York on charges of conspiracy and mail fraud. A month later, Garcia and two other UNIA officials were arrested on the same charges. It would take federal prosecutors nearly a year and a half to convict Garvey on the mail fraud charges. The UNIA head would not actually begin serving his 5-year term at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary until February 1925. In the meantime, the Garcia report would come back to haunt Garvey and the UNIA in other ways. Less than 2 weeks after Garvey's initial arrest, President King was at last handed a copy of the secret memo in which Garcia had denounced the America leadership as degenerated and weak morally. For the increasingly suspicious King, Garvey's arrest and Garcia's report meant that he could disengage his country from the UNIA. He wasted no time dismantling the organization's operations in Liberia. He had Gabriel Johnson dismissed as mayor of Monrovia and replaced by Andrew Butler, the police chief who had grilled Garvey's envoy so rudely 2 years before. This latter appointment must have been especially gratifying to the president, who, like many of the America Old Guard, had always bristled at Johnson's potentate title, stately, UNIA, robes, and $12,000 per annum salary, nearly 5 times that of the president's. The America elite remained divided, however. King represented the old mercantile elite, which envisioned the country yoked to a broader, transatlantic economy dominated by America. He led the ruling True Whig Party, whose core lay in settler-thick Monrovia and its environs. UNIA backers such as Johnson, meanwhile, had inherited Blyden's dream of a Liberia that was African before it was anything else. They were typically members of the opposition People's Party and lived in the upriver settlements that would benefit from immigration. But all Liberians understood what Garvey did not, that wariness and secrecy were the keys to their country's geopolitics. Secretary of State Edwin Barclay did open up to Critchlow in the earlier days of the UNIA-Liberian relationship, and revealed a foundational aspect of the Liberian worldview. It is not always advisable nor politic to openly expose our secret intentions, our secret thoughts, he said, in cautioning the UNIA to tone down its anti-imperialist rhetoric, lest it arouse the suspicions of Britain and France. That is the way we do, or rather don't do, things, in Liberia, We don't tell them, white imperialists, what we think, we only tell them what we like them to hear, what in fact, they like to hear." On November 27, 1922, the U.S. Senate ignored State Department lobbying and denied the Liberian loan, caving to pressure from Midwestern isolationists who wondered how the government could find $5 million for Liberia and nothing for suffering farmers, from Southerners angry at the loan sponsor's other piece of legislation, an anti-lynching bill, and from assorted Republicans who saw no reason they should honor a pledge first made by the detested Woodrow Wilson administration. King did not go scrambling back to the UNIA, as Garvey might have hoped, however. World War I had not fundamentally changed the dynamics of West African geopolitics, other than removing Germany from the picture. He still had to consider the reaction of London and Paris to Liberian actions, and both capitals had decided that Garvey was more than a mere irritant. In a speech in January 1920, he had promised war against Europe, saying that Europeans talk about their airplanes, and about their machine guns. You just wait a while. In the next 2 years we are going to show them that all their tanks and machine guns and aeroplanes will be like Santa Claus toys to what we mean to put out. Throughout Western and Southern Africa, British and French colonial officials barred UNIA agitators and deported local Garveyites. Garvey's rhetoric was ultimately responsible for the Liberian elite's decision to distance itself from him and his organization. King patiently tried to explain this to UNIA officials. "Representatives of the Garvey movement have visited me," he told a reporter for the Baltimore Afro-American in 1921. "And I have urged them to discard their political propaganda and the impossible talk about driving the white race out of Africa." He was more specific in his discussions with U.S. State Department officials. The danger existed that foreign countries, particularly France and England, might become anxious with regard to the position of Liberia in connection with this movement, i.e., the UNIA. Meanwhile, the feuding among the Garveyites and Monrovia and revelations that much of the loan money set aside for Liberian development had been stolen by association officials undid what remained of the UNIA's credibility among ordinary Liberians, many of whom had once believed in its battle cry of black solidarity, even as they hoped that its plans for Africa would bring much-needed jobs and economic development. As Johnson explained to UNIA delegates at the annual convention in August 1922, the organization was now looked upon by many of the people there as a huge joke. Though it did tone down talk about the liberation of Africa, the UNIA did not give up its plans for Liberia. It sent a new delegation to Liberia at the end of 1923 to negotiate yet another settlement agreement with the authorities in Monrovia. The 3 members, including actress Henrietta Vinton Davis, famed for her Negro dialect renditions of Shakespeare, received the usual enthusiastic reception during an event organized by the local UNIA chapter, with ex-President Arthur Barkley and Chief Justice J.J. Dawson in attendance. After putting off the meeting numerous times, King also received them, but his early ambivalence about the UNIA had turned to wariness. He went out of his way to deny reports that UNIA immigrants were not wanted and once again offered land for settlement and promises of full cooperation from his government. But he made it clear that the meeting was not official, but between private citizens only. As for the UNIA's plans, any immigrants would have to come as individuals, not in groups sponsored by outside organizations, and they would be scattered about the country. Liberia had to keep in mind, he said, its obligation to the great powers, i.e., Britain and France, and as such to the maintenance of the independence of the Republic. The always effervescent Davis did not seem to understand the import of King's terms. "The 3 of us went home," she reported later to UNIA officials, "feeling so happy that we had accomplished that for which we were sent." Garvey greeted the optimistic reports with his usual ebullience. In a May 1924 editorial in Negro World he once again called for African Americans to immigrate to Liberia. A month later, he announced plans for a new delegation, this time of technical experts who would start building the infrastructure in preparation for the arrival of the emigrant masses. Acting as if King's warnings against large emigrant expeditions were really for the consumption of officials in London and Paris, the UNIA began running ads announcing its plans for 4 colonies in Liberia, including detailed layouts for a settlement at Cape Palmas, provocatively close to the French frontier. On June 20, 1924, Garvey's technical experts set out from New York Harbor, 10 days after a dispatch by Abraham Butler in Monrovia had appeared in the pages of the anti-Garveyite Baltimore Afro-American. "We in Liberia are tired of reading dumps of the Negro World in which appear articles misleading of the American Negro, which goes to give them an idea that they have been asked or would be welcomed in coming to Liberia," he complained, before offering to pay Garvey $10,000 if he could produce a single letter from President King giving him the permission to land his immigrants in Liberia. His countryman, the former police chief warned, would do everything it took to stem a Garvey invasion, including armed resistance, bloodshed, even a call on England and France for help. The UNIA thought that Butler could be ignored. The Reverend R. Van Richards, chaplain to the Liberian Senate, said to a mass gathering at Liberty Hall that summer that far more important personages than Butler supported its plans. "Do you think if the Liberian government did not desire to help this movement to develop the country," he asked his audience, "Chief Justice Dawson would take any part in it?" Garvey did not respond directly to the Butler piece. Instead, he praised the leader of the latest expedition, a civil engineer named William Wallace Strange. "We have found our Colonel George Washington Goethals, such a man as Colonel Roosevelt, i.e., President Theodore Roosevelt, found when he undertook the Panama Canal," Garvey told a cheering send-off crowd at Liberty Hall. "We have our Goethals who is going to lay the foundation of Africa's commercial and industrial development under the auspices of the Universal Negro Improvement Association." But Liberia had already turned emphatically against the UNIA. Liberians could not help but notice that the published outline for the Cape Palomas colony included not just churches, parks, and schools, but a courthouse and police station. This was, they felt, a sure sign that the UNIA intended to set up an alternative civil administration for its colonies, in direct violation not only of Liberian law but of the UNIA's promises that its intentions were strictly commercial and industrial. Those who believed that UNIA money nevertheless outweighed potential infringements on national sovereignty were disabused of their faith in Garvey when officials from the U.S. Shipping Board asked Liberian authorities to seize tens of thousands of dollars of UNIA goods in the customs house at Cape Palomas. Garvey's check to the vendor had bounced. In late June, as Garvey's delegation steamed toward Europe, en route to Monrovia, Secretary of State Edwin Barclay instructed the local agent of the Elder Dempster shipping line that the passengers would not be allowed to land and that the expenses of their return voyage would be the company's responsibility. UNIA immigration to Liberia finally and officially ended on July 3, when Barclay instructed Ernest Lyon, Liberia's American consul, to meet with U.S. State Department officials and request that they neither facilitate nor permit the immigration under the auspices of the Universal Negro Improvement Association of Negroes from the United States with intent to proceed to Liberia. Lyon then went public, warning prospective UNIA immigrants that the government of Liberia would not issue them visas. The Garveyites' initial response to the ban was conciliatory. They cited enemies of our race for instigating trouble between the Liberian government and the UNIA. At the organization's annual convention in August 1924, the delegates, in an open letter to King, expressed their official disbelief that the head of a Negro state could be responsible for doing anything that would tend to dampen the spirit of love that the people of the Universal Negro Improvement Association have for you and your country and the effort that they are making to assist in making your nation the pride of the race and a credit to your civilization. Chaplain Richards assured the delegates that, as soon as the Liberian government had been truly informed of the power, honesty and sincerity of the association, all would be well. Garvey himself blamed the U.S. government and his longtime nemesis, W. E. B. Du Bois, for the failure of his Liberia plans. There was likely some truth in the accusation. The United States had made Du Bois its representative at King's second term inauguration, the kind of subtle diplomatic message Liberian officialdom was so adept at recognizing. Du Bois, for his part, categorically denied that he had anything to do at all with the relations of Garvey and the Republic of Liberia. But because he had never been shy about denouncing Garvey, there is no reason to think he would have kept mum in Liberia, a country for which he felt great affection despite his dislike of the idea of emigration. Garvey had projected his own assumptions about Pan-African solidarity onto an America-Liberian elite most interested in its political and economic survival. It was true. The editors of the pro-government Liberian News noted a month after the visa ban was issued, that Liberia was premised on the idea of a haven for the oppressed black masses. But times had changed. Our political position is between two powerful colonizing states of a race different to our own. Our experience in the past has been to lose territory after territory through these powerful neighbors under some flimsy pretext or other. Liberia did not plan to be further reduced by the UNIA's unruly presence within its borders. The dalliance with the UNIA thus prodded Liberia to think seriously about its position in the modern world, and what its purpose was a century after the first colonists had arrived. King pithily described the changes his nation had undergone, and what kind of future beckoned. Liberians, standing alone and fighting their own national battles for the last 100 years, have developed a national point of view, he explained in his annual message to the legislature in 1924. They fully realize and are conscious of the fact that Liberia's immediate objective is toward nationalism and not racialism, the making of a nation and not a race. Making a nation required money, though, and Liberia, as always, had little of it. The UNIA was rejected on principle, yes, but also because the King administration believed it had found, after the failure of the Harding and Garvey loans, a new benefactor. Harvey Firestone, Sr., among the last of the self-made autocrats of the American Industrial Revolution, came to Liberia to build the world's largest rubber plantation and thereby to reassert his control over the industry, which had grown exponentially after the advent of the automobile. It is not clear who within the Firestone organization first suggested Liberia, but the idea was an inspired one. Hevea brasiliensis, the most productive of latex sap trees, grew even more prolifically there than it did in Malaya, where the British cultivated it on a vast scale, as proven on a small plantation set up years before at Mount Barkley. In June 1924, Firestone sent his personal secretary to meet with King. The two quickly reached an understanding, a 99-year lease for 1 million acres at the extremely low rent of 6 cents an acre, per year. Outright purchase of land by foreigners was prohibited under the Liberian constitution. There would be no taxes either, other than a 1% levy on exports, and that wouldn't start for 6 years. Firestone would also be granted a monopoly. No other foreigner could grow rubber in the country. In return, his company bowed to the Liberian elite's reflexive sovereignty concerns and racial anxieties. Local natives would be given preferential treatment in hiring and white staff would be limited to 1,500. Firestone's men left for Ohio, having been assured that, in Liberia, the government went along with what the president agreed to. Indeed, a few in the legislature had qualms, particularly about whether the long-term lease violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Constitution, but in the end it did what it always did when pressured by the president: it approved the deal. Then came the cable from Akron, Ohio. Firestone was sending his envoy back and he wanted to know if the legislature would stay in session till the envoy arrived. He'd even pay their salaries. This provoked outrage. Even King agreed that Firestone's offer was an affront to Liberian sovereignty, and so refused it. When he arrived in January 1925, Firestone's man explained why his boss had made the offer in the first place. He was worried about Liberia reneging, by cutting a better deal with European competitors, for instance. Firestone did not like leaving anything to chance. Liberia would have to take out a $5 million loan if it wanted him to invest in the country as well as grant his company oversight of the nation's finances. By accepting such a heavy obligation and intrusion into its affairs, Liberia would cede control of its treasury to Firestone, just as it had to the United States government earlier in the century. Firestone would also have the ability to veto any outside deal. As one U.S. State Department official noted to a company representative, with the loan, Mr. Firestone could virtually be the government. Though the tire maker's money would allow the country to pay off its many other debts, the Liberians' impulse was to say no, just as they had to Garvey, and for much the same reasons. As one newspaper editor put it, would taking the money represent the bartering away of our sovereign rights for a mess of potage? Particularly galling was that Liberia would have to pay for its own indenture, footing the salaries, amounting to tens of thousands of dollars annually, of the Firestone officials who would administer the country's finances. The handbills that began appearing on Monrovia's streets captured the prevailing sentiment: American occupation of Liberia arranged by President King. Both the cabinet and legislature rejected the loan. King, however, could not afford to be indignant. Firestone was threatening to pull out of Liberia and to take with him the protective embrace of the American government, which had been so critical to Liberia's defense against meddlesome European nations. U.S. Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg read Monrovia diplomats riot-act. The Liberian government should fulfill the planting agreements in strict accord with its pledged word. With no other options, the Liberia legislature ratified both the lease and loan agreements in November and December of 1926. It secured two face-saving clauses. Firestone agreed to an arbitration process for disputes and, to assuage Liberian fears of a single corporation holding so much power, the rubber company spun off a wholly owned subsidiary to administer the loan. But few people on either side of the Atlantic were fooled. 3/4 of a century after a band of free blacks and freed slaves had proudly declared their independence from one American institution, the American Colonization Society, their impoverished and indebted descendants had, out of necessity, capitulated to another. Liberia would remain a virtually wholly owned subsidiary of Harvey Firestone until its economic expansion after World War II, and the Pan-African dreams of Blyden and Garvey would never again play a serious role in the nation of the America-Liberians.